Two quick things before we begin. This story is based on small-town truths, the kind people whisper after the lights go out. Listen close. It might make your spine tingle. If you like what you hear, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Your support helps keep these longer, quiet stories alive. Subscribe now and ring the bell so you won't miss the rest. I remember it like a photograph in my pocket, sharp at the edges, blurred where the light hits. I was the town reporter then, the kind who covers bake sales and burnouts and knows the names of everyone's grandchildren. Our town had a name on the map, but people mostly called it Holloway Ridge, a line of houses clinging to a river bend where cornrows ended and old hills began. Holloway Ridge smelled of wood smoke and fried dough in the mornings, and on Sundays it smelled of lilies and coffee at St. Agnes, the little brick church with the chipped stone virgin at its front lawn. We've always believed in two kinds of miracles at Holloway Ridge, the kind the pastor mentions in his sermon and the kind you do not speak about at breakfast. There were town traditions that stitched us together. The Veterans Day Parade, where folks left paper carnations at the memorial, the Fall Festival, where kids bobbed for apples while older men argued about who made the best stew. Old stories lived in porches and at the feed store. We told them like the weather. Not to change the fact, only the tone. There was a legend, whispered and never printed in the paper, about a woman in blue who walked the ridge on certain moonless nights. No one could tell you when it started. Some said she came from before the town was paved. Others said she showed up when the river had taken something that could not be replaced. That sort of thing sits in the background of our lives like an old radiator. You only notice when it stops working. The man who drew all of this smaller, stranger attention was named Henry Lancaster. He was what you called well-off, in a place where being well-off often meant owning the mill or a string of rental properties. Henry's house sat on a rise just above the bakery, a gray farmhouse with ivy swallowing its porch. The kind of place people like to point at when they said, if anyone can fix Holloway Ridge, it's Henry Lancaster. He had the look of someone used to buying quick answers, a neat haircut, a coat that never smelled of smoke, shoes that still held the shine from the store. He'd come back to town years ago and bought the old mill, promised jobs, promised new sidewalks, and in the short term, people liked him for that. I had been writing small features for the Ridge Gazette and doing the occasional opinion column when I first noticed Henry in a way I hadn't expected. Not buying things, but giving them away. It was a soft event. He handed a paper bag with something warm to a man sitting by the bridge. The man had no coat that day, and his hands were folded like he'd given up on holding anything steady. The bag was simple: ham and beans, a biscuit and apple. But what took my breath was how Henry looked afterward. Not superior, not satisfied, but nervous, almost embarrassed, like a boy caught doing what he should have done all along. I follow the story because that's what I do. I know the rhythm of a photograph, the first frame that makes you look longer. When I asked Henry what made him stop, he didn't answer with a neat quote. He told me, quietly, that he couldn't stand the way the man looked at the river when no one was watching. Like he kept waiting for someone, Henry said. Like he had a map and it was folded wrong. The man at the bridge was named Tom Barrett. People called him Tommy sometimes, and at other times they didn't call him anything at all. He was older than his years suggested, with a jaw like glass and stories that crept out if you offered him a cigarette or a biscuit. The first time I sat with him, he smelled of rain and rust. He told me he had been in Vietnam. He didn't list medals or missions. He said it like one might say where they worked, matter of fact. You can see too much over there, he said, folding his good hand under his chin. Makes you forget how to sleep. Tom's voice had the flatness of someone who had seen long silences. He told me small things in the way veterans sometimes do, about a river that looked like it was flowing the wrong way, about nights so black you could see the weight of it. He had knots of stories, but he kept close the important ones, the ones that cut out of long lists and dropped into their own plate. What Henry did that afternoon, hand over a bag without a camera crew or a speech, grew in town to something larger. People started looking at Henry differently. Old Mrs. Greeley from the bakery said, "I never thought he had it in him." The priest, Father Mallory, noted it from the pulpit with a sermon about charity that made several men shift in their pews. But it wasn't charity that hooked me. It was a detail Tom offered without thinking. He looked at Henry, then at me, then back at the river and said, "You know, the Mary used to pray right there." He pointed at a bend by the bridge where the water caught the sunset and made a mirror out of the sky. "Used to be a statue," he said. "Used to light candles there." I asked him when. He shrugged like he was clearing his throat. "Before I left," he said. "Before everything got loud. We had a statue, all right. St. Agnes had their Virgin, chipped and softened by 100 winters, in the church lawn where the town left flowers for babies and for harvests. But Tom spoke of a Mary who once stood by the river, a roadside virgin with a candle box where people could leave pennies and prayers. No one had mentioned it in years. When I asked about it, Elena Ruiz at the feed store told me a slow story about the time the statue got knocked over by the hurricane 10 years back and how a group of teenagers had pushed it into the bushes for a laugh. Kids will be kids, Elena said, but her hands betrayed how she still thought of the statue like a thing that mattered. You could see a change creep into Holloway Ridge after that. It was a small change at first. A few jars of honey spilling in the pantry, a truck that wouldn't start, cows birthing late in a bad storm. The old men in the diner blamed weather and bad wiring. The youngsters laughed about a curse in the corner booth because you have to find ways to laugh about the things that make your hands shake. But then Father Mallory got called to 3 funerals in a month. Accidents. Each one separate, each one unconnected at first glance. And his voice thinned in the confessional. "We are a small town," he said to me once, with an edge I hadn't heard before. "Small towns pile things on like storm debris. We do not always know which branch will be the one to bruise us." The desecration came like thieves in the night. It was not a crime of theft. They didn't steal the altar cloth or the brass candlesticks. Someone, or several someones, had walked into the old cemetery behind Street Agnes and stood the marble cross on its side. The little roadside virgin by the river, which had hardly anyone to guard it now, was found with its head cracked open like a porcelain egg. That morning the town felt the way you feel when you open the refrigerator and realize you forgot to lock a door. A sudden, small dread. Kids said it was kids. They said it like a fact to cover the fact that grown folk were shaking. People gathered outside the church, hands hovering over the broken pieces with the same delicacy they used to pick up a baby bird. Mrs. Greeley knelt and touched the Virgin's face with gloves, the way you touch a photograph you were never supposed to own. Father Mallory said Mass for the broken things, and for a town that felt more brittle than usual. "We are caretakers," he said, and his voice held the poetry of someone whose job has always been to insist that the unseen matters. After that, the accidents got stranger. A farmer who never missed a day lost a row of pumpkins overnight to frost in July. A teenager walked across the main street and swore she saw a woman in a pale blue dress near the river, but when she told her parents the woman was gone, only the water moving like a black sheet. Later that week, the bakery's oven gave out, the same oven that had been serviced last month. People began to keep their stories of seeing lights and hearing soft singing to themselves, because once you say such things aloud in a place like Holloway Ridge, you invite the world to ask questions that have no comfortable answers. The town meetings changed tone. We're the kind of place that holds a potluck to fix what can be fixed. At the meeting in the community hall, Henry sat in the front row with his hands folded like someone waiting to be forgiven. He had donated part of his estate for new lighting around the church and riverbank, but the donations didn't stop the unease. "You can't patch everything with a lamp," old Mr. Denby said. "Light don't mend what's been torn." Denby had lost his son overseas years ago, and he spoke with the authority of someone who had watched hard things happen and stayed to name them. Tom kept the bridge. People passed him with new glances, a little softer, more like the way you touch a portrait of Saint. He began to tell me a story that made my pen slow down because it had the cadence of something older than any of us, about a night in the late 60s when, he said, the river had given up something it couldn't afford. He spoke, finally, about a medal he carried that had been lost and then found, about prayers on a roadside, about a woman who prayed and kept her hands warm even in winter. He didn't speak of miracles as miracles. He told them like one tells the weather. Factual, then gone. People began to leave small offerings by where the roadside virgin used to stand. A jar of coins, a handful of sugar, a small white candle in a mason jar. Offerings that felt like little Morse code signals to a sky that might still be listening. That's when the dreams started. I talked to a baker who dreamed of a woman whose eyes were as sad as a closed book. A truck driver said he woke with mud on his knees and the smell of lilies. These things thread through a town like a fine spider silk. You only see the web when you catch a breath in the dark. When I asked Henry about Tom and that bag of food, he told me this. He said something like, "You have more than you need." Then he looked at me like a man trying to find the word for a name. He said the word, remember, like someone tapping the shoulder of a friend. Henry admitted to me, with the kind of half-laugh people use to keep their hands from shaking, that he had found himself at night walking the riverbank. "I don't know if I was looking for the statue or looking for what it meant," he said. But he paused, the word breaking like glass. There was a feeling, like a watch had been set wrong. The priest started receiving notes. Folded paper left in his mailbox with single words in trembling handwriting. Forgive, remember, light. People with no connection to each other told the same story. Of a figure in blue seen near the river, of a hand on their shoulder when they were at their most tired. Others denied everything. People do have a convenient talent for disbelief when a mathematics of fear gets too big. But there were more and more small things that didn't add up. A child who would not sleep unless a candle burned in the window. A neighbor's dog that howled on the same night each week and would not be soothed. That's when rumors started. Not the kind that end with a punchline, but the kind that gather shape like a storm cloud. A rumor that Henry had been sick and was hiding it. A rumor that the broken statue had been more than plaster. A rumor that Tom's service in Vietnam had put him in touch with something that wanted to be remembered. I say rumor because that's the honest newspaper word. The stories we traded in the diner were not always facts, so much as feelings made solid in conversation. Still, you could watch Henry at church and see a man who moved like someone who had been asked to stand under a spotlight. In the last week before the town felt it had to act, there was a night when all of Holloway Ridge woke to a sound like a bell struck from a great distance. People walked outside in slippers and bare feet, breathing the cold bite of late summer air, and they saw a glow over the river, not the kind of light from a truck or a lamp, but a softness that made the willow leaves look like they were dipped in milk. Tom was there at the bridge, standing as always, but with something different in his stance. Not vigilance, but relief, like a man whose mileage on his watch had finally been measured right. He did not speak to me that night, but he nodded to Henry when Henry arrived, and Henry's face changed in a way I could not read. Part wonder, part something like fear. That was the last easy night. The town's radios reported a blackout in a neighboring county. The mayor called for calm and said the town would meet to put lights up and to check in on one another. Old Mr. Denby muttered at the meeting that sometimes the best way to listen is to shut off the instruments. If we keep pointing flashlights, we'll never see what's been hiding in shadow, he said, and half the room laughed because what else do you do with a fear that smells like the past? I left that night with my notebook heavy in my pocket and a sense that something in Holloway Ridge was older than our daily habits. The statue lay in a box in the rectory where Father Mallory could only look at it and cry like a man cutting onions. Henry drove home slowly, his headlights making black puddles of the lanes, and Tom remained by the bridge, a silhouette against the softened light. People locked doors, but not because they were afraid of strangers. They were afraid of forgetting how to be small and faithful and human around each other. I drove past the bakery window and saw a single candle burning on the sill, its flames steady against a late wind. I imagined the woman in the blue dress, if she existed, pausing at the window, maybe smiling something that we in Holloway Ridge would call gentle and unsparing. I thought of veterans and of statues and of the little acts that can till the life. I thought of Henry handing a bag to a man who was not just any man, and I thought, without knowing why, that whatever was about to come would not be loud. It would be a whisper that made the town remember itself. That night, as I slept, I dreamed of the river. In the dream, the water held faces like fish, blinking slowly beneath the surface. A hand reached up and touched my palm from under the water, and I woke with the wet image burned behind my eyes. When I went to the window, there was a single footprint in the dew on my lawn. Not mine, not any of the neighbors, and leading toward the bridge. I didn't tell anyone about the footprint at first. I filed the story about the statue as news, and I put a photograph in the paper of men gathered outside St. Agnes repairing what they could. The headline read, "Town mourns, repairs underway." But small towns keep small truth like coal in their pockets. It glows under the skin. And as I locked my office that morning, I noticed a folded piece of paper on my desk with one word: remember. That's where part of the story sits now. At the point where people begin to look over their shoulders and ask what they once took for granted. Henry keeps appearing at the river. Tom keeps a quiet watch. The town lights go up, and still, the soft things persist. And somewhere beyond the cracked statue, the old legend of the woman in blue is stirring, like a bell just touched and waiting to be struck again. You'd think, as a reporter, I'd be the one to explain it all. But some things in Holloway Ridge resist being explained. The more I ask, the smaller the answers feel. The people start to tell me their dreams, and the priest hands me a note with a trembling verse scribbled in his handwriting. There is, as always, a pause between what we see and what we dare to say. And then, the day before the parish planned a new blessing ceremony, Henry came to the bridge alone and sat down beside Tom. He did not bring change or lights. He took off his coat and sat with his hands on his knees, and he said two words that made Tom's eyes go very distant. The words were simple, and I still write them down at night when sleep feels thin. I remember. Then Henry looked at me like a man who had heard a bell and could not stop ringing. He stood up slowly and walked away without another word. Later that night, a neighbor found Henry standing in his yard staring up into the sky, pale as paper, and he could not speak. He was taken to his bed by his housekeeper and wrapped in blankets, but he did not sleep. At dawn, there was a single knock on Father Mallory's rectory door. Outside stood a man with wet hair and the look of someone who had been up all night talking to the river. He spoke to no one, only handed the priest a small, soaked photograph with a note on the back, "For when we need to remember." Father Mallory closed his eyes as if the paper were wound. I did not expect to be the one to tell this much of the story. Reporters are supposed to be steady-eyed and objective, but Holloway Ridge had a way of softening the edges of things. The weeks that followed the broken statue felt like walking through a thin fog. Steps were visible, but what lay beyond each step was not. People began to tell me things they never told a news person. I wrote them down because that is what I could do: collect, hold, try to make sense. Henry's first sighting of the Virgin did not happen in a church or at an altar. It happened in his kitchen. He called me the next morning with a voice that sounded split down the middle. Practical on one side, stunned on the other. He asked me to meet him at the bakery before sunrise. He wanted to talk, he said, and he could not find the words to say over the phone. I met him by the window, where the counter light laced the sugar tins. Henry had not slept. His face looked like someone who had been trying to hold down a very heavy secret. He told me what happened slowly, the way you tell a story you're not sure you believe. It was late, Henry said. I woke up because, I don't know, it felt like someone had put a hand on my chest to steady me. He paused and pressed his thumb into the edge of the napkin he held. At first, I thought it was a dream. He described a woman in blue standing at the foot of his bed, but not as an old painting or a statue. She looked alive, he said, not like a projection, but like a person who had put on a robe and walked out of the night. Her hair was dark, and her hands were empty but steady. When he asked her why she was there, Henry said she tilted her head as if listening to something he could not hear. She told me, Henry said, that I had something inside me that I did not know about. She said it was small yet dangerous because I had been avoiding it. He squinted, as if trying to find a sentence in the air again. She told me I had to see a doctor. He laughed bitterly at that. Me? See a doctor because of a dream? I've made my living measuring risk, not looking at it in the mirror. But the look on his face was not defiant. It was frightened. He went on to say that when he reached for the woman's hand, as one reaches for a coat, the air smelled of lilies and rain. It was not a scary thing, he said. More like an urgent thing. Like someone knocking and not answering because they don't know the door is ours. Henry was not a man given to seeing things. He was the sort who had built businesses with spreadsheets and hard deadlines. Yet he asked me, quietly, to keep his sighting out of the paper for now. He told me he wanted to find a reason that made sense. People who come clean with visions sometimes ask for silence first. They fear being painted as strange. He did not want attention. He wanted a test. Tom heard about Henry's sighting the way news moves through a small town. A slow current that arrives, changed, and often truer than the first headline. Tom came by the bridge and sat, as he always did, though his hand shook more these days. He told Henry, with surprising tenderness, that he had once seen the same light when he was in a place full of noise and confusion. He didn't call what he saw a virgin, only that a woman in a blue dress had stood where the map of his life had been torn. You don't have to be holy to listen, Tom said, his voice thin as winter bread. Sometimes the thing that finds you is only trying to warn you. I think ghosts and saints use the same language sometimes. It's a language I didn't want to learn. He reached across and put his good hand on Henry's arm like it was a small benediction. The town's priest, Father Mallory, took a different tack. He read scripture and turned to ritual. He told the congregation that visions alone are not the sum of faith. They are signs that require humility and action. He began to lead more frequent prayers at the church, and people came in slow streams, as if to a cool place during a hot day. The air felt slightly more watchful in the pews. Offerings multiplied at the foot of the altar. Still, the broken roadside statue by the river lay in a box in the rectory, its face wrapped in cloth like someone trying to protect a secret. There was history to the place, too, and history likes to press its own fingerprints into the present. My grandmother had once told me a story about the river, about a night in 1937 when the flood rose faster than anyone expected and a child disappeared from a farmhouse porch. The family searched for days. Then, on the third night, an old woman in a blue shawl walked the town and led them to a shallow place where the child lay asleep on a bed of reeds, unharmed. The woman vanished after the child was found. People started to tell that story again. As people do when the present asks for proof, it is not entirely alone. Other voices joined the chorus. Mrs. Greeley at the bakery told me about an old photo she had in a drawer, a black and white picture of a procession along the riverbank with a statue draped in blue. We used to have a little shrine there, she said. We were different then. We had more time to be afraid and less reason to make noise about it. Elena Ruiz, who ran the feed store, said her grandmother always left a bit of bread on the doorstep on certain nights because she believed it kept a promise. If you start doing small things like that, Elena said, the world seems kinder. The town began to feel its old maps again, as if the broken statue was a symptom, not the disease. People started to remember other times when the world had felled off, an odd string of hearth fires in the 50s, an unexplained sickness among cattle in the 70s, and tie them to the same invisible thread. These recollections were not necessarily true in a strict sense, but they held truth as memory sees it, patchy, human, and persuasive. Henry did not want these conversations on the front page, but he did want a doctor. He went, finally, because the visit had been asked of him both by a woman in blue and by his own suddenly tender survival instinct. The first tests were routine. Let's rule out the easy things first, the doctor said. The doctor was careful, professional. He moved like a person who had seen so much worry that worry itself had worn thin. Blood was drawn, a scanner word, and Henry listened to the soft hum like a man waiting for a clock to strike. The tests were inconclusive, nothing that jumped out with a red flag. Yet the doctor's face, when he spoke in the hallway, tightened like a door catching in a storm. There's something, the doctor said, and then checked himself because doctors know how their words can make a life tilt. A shadow. We need to look closer. It may be nothing. It may be something treatable, but we will need more tests. Henry left with a stack of forms and an appointment for more imaging. He tried to tell himself it was simple, procedural, an abundance of caution in modern medicine. But everywhere the town met him afterward, people looked at him like a man who had accepted an invitation he had not planned to attend. And then the accidents deepened in a way that was no longer random. The river that had always been generous with fish gave up a log in the middle of the night, and someone found a child's doll tangled in its snag. Someone's cat disappeared and later returned with a white feather in its mouth. A window in the church that had never been broken was shattered from the inside, as if something inside the room had decided to leave in a hurry. None of these events were loud enough to be obviously supernatural, but they rounded into shape when enough people saw them. We were looking for a pattern, and patterns were starting to form like frost. Henry's sleep got worse. He told me about nights where he would find himself awake at 3 a.m. and walk toward the river without remembering starting. He started carrying a small pocket rosary he hadn't touched since his mother's funeral. Once, in the hospital waiting room, he ran his thumb over the beads until it thinned his skin. He began to hear the same soft music at the edges of his hearing, a litany he could not place, like someone humming over a baby's cradle. When he spoke in public, his words came out in careful parcels, as if each sentence had to be weighed. Tom kept his watch. He would come and sit by the bridge and talk to Henry about things that had nothing to do with visions, the price of feed, the weather, a recipe that used too much salt. We keep talking about life because that's what keeps it from being a story, Tom said one morning, grinding his cigarette out on the curb. If we let everything be a miracle, we stop learning to mend fences. Yet Tom, too, confessed to me a private occurrence. He dreamed, more and more often, that he was back in the jungle and a woman in blue was walking toward him with a light. She never said anything, he told me. She just looked like she wanted me to follow, and when I reached out, I woke up holding my own hand like it was a knife. Veterans are like men who have learned to carry silence. When they speak, their words are heavy. Father Mallory, meanwhile, began to collect the little things people left at the rectory. Handwritten notes, a child's crayon drawing of a woman in blue, a photograph of a family who believed a prayer had saved them. He read them aloud sometimes, not in a sermon, but in private, and his voice caught on the names. He admitted to me, quietly, that faith sometimes comes in the form of asking for proof. We ask, and then we are surprised when the answer is not what we expected, he said. We are fragile, and yet we are brave enough to knock. Then the visions multiplied. Not everyone saw the woman at once, but more and more people reported waking with a chilled hand on their shoulder or with the smell of lilies in the kitchen. Some said they saw her reflected in a church window. Others said they found a folded paper in their mailbox with the word remember or forgive. A group of teenagers admitted, after too much cider and not enough sleep, that they had tried to disturb the rectory box where the broken statue lay and had run away because the grass felt like hands. When a town's teenagers are frightened, the adults begin to suspect something is real, or at least that something is changing how the town acts. At the next meeting in the community hall, the air was thick with damp wool and more than one prayer. People brought casseroles and candles and their own stories. Henry arrived and sat in the back, hands folded. He had a look on him like someone waiting for an inspection, but not sure of the criteria. The mayor spoke about organizing volunteers to rebuild the shrine by the river. Father Mallory asked for a night of vigil. The town debated. Do we rebuild with stone and screws? Or do we rebuild with the soft things that keep a place human? In the end, they decided to do both. On the way out, a frail woman I had never seen before stopped Henry and pressed something into his hand. It was a scrap of blue fabric, as thin as a prayer. She said nothing but nodded, and her eyes brimmed. Henry folded the scrap into his pocket like a secret talisman. That night, Henry drank more than usual. He went home, walked to his bedroom, and there she was again. The woman in blue stood in the doorway, not like an intruder, but like someone who had been waiting at an appointment. This time she did not speak. She touched his hand lightly and then laid a palm across his chest. Henry said later that it felt like winter and church combined. Cold, clean, and somehow merciful. She told me, Henry said, when he told me the next day, that silence is a kind of sickness too. She said if you ignore what's inside, it grows louder. He looked at me with an anger that belonged to a man who had been too busy to listen. She said, do not be a stranger to your own life. And then, the part that wrenched the town into what would come. Henry collapsed in his bed shortly after. Not a dramatic fall that breaks the world into pieces, more like the body deciding to stop arguing. His housekeeper found him and called an ambulance. He was taken to the ER and admitted for more tests. The doctor who had said shadow now looked at him with a new gravity. We found something, he said, but I can't say more until we have the scan results. Word moved like a slow river. Holloway Ridge kept its watch. People left candles at the church window and said prayers in lines and under their breath. Tom sat at the bridge and watched the water as if it might give him an answer. Father Mallory visited Henry in the hospital and prayed for him like a man who understood he was rubbing at the edge of a mystery. Henry's face remained steady, less afraid now perhaps because the warning had been heeded. Or perhaps fear simply changes its shape when someone else holds the door. I stood in the hospital corridor and watched the town gather around a man who had once been their benefactor and who now needed tenderness instead of contracts. It felt like watching our hands turned outward, suddenly open. The tests were pending. The town waited. Outside, the river moved like nothing had happened at all. Inside, we were all careful with our words. The woman in blue had told Henry to see a doctor. He did. Now Holloway Ridge was suspended between hope and what they called in lower voices the worst. If a miracle was coming, it was taking its time. If a punishment was coming, it was patient. The town had been given a warning in a voice that smelled of lilies. They had obeyed, but obedience is not the same as safety. The next part of this story is not a neat turn. It is not a movie cut. It is a slow tightening where prayer and science and memory rub together until heat starts to rise. People will begin to see things that cannot be explained away by coincidence. Old grudges will look foolish. New acts of courage will be demanded. I left the hospital that night with Henry's rosary in my pocket. The beads were worn at the edges. I checked my recorder and forgot to turn it on when Father Mallory spoke to me in the empty corridor. He said, softly, we have been given a reminder that faith is not just comfort. Sometimes it is a call to be honest with ourselves. His eyes shone like wet coins. When I walked out, the sky was a deep, spare black. Over the river, a sliver of light arced like a promise. I could not tell if it was a star or a street lamp, but it felt important that it was there. I am leaving you here, with Henry hospitalized, the town watching the scan results, Tom's steady presence at the bridge, and 1,000 small offerings gathering like a hush. The woman in blue has spoken. The doctors have seen their shadow. The town waits for what will come of that meeting between heaven and medicine. I knew the last part of this story would not be a neat paragraph or a tidy headline. Holloway Ridge does not close its books that way. What came next was louder than gossip and quieter than prayer. A reckoning that mixed hospital fluorescence with candle wax, medical charts with the smell of lilies, facts with things that felt like facts. Henry's surgery was scheduled for a gray Thursday. The doctor called it careful and necessary. Father Mallory called it a day to pray. The town called it the day we leaned into whatever might rise out of the river. People came to the vigil by the old bridge as if they were going to meet someone they'd known all their life. They brought quilts and canned goods and little jars with coins. They brought rosaries or none at all. Belief in Holloway Ridge is as varied as the weather. I stood near the railing, my notebook closed in my hands, and watched. Tom was there as he always was, but different. He had a clean shirt on, and he smelled of tobacco and rain. He had cut his hair short in a way that made him look younger, or at least the kind of younger that comes before heavy sleeping. He kept his distance from Henry's people, but he met Henry's eyes and nodded like men do when they have said too much and cannot say more. At dusk, we lit candles and placed them along the riverbank where the roadside virgin once stood. Father Mallory read from a small book, and the words rose and fell like a tide. People whispered private prayers, the kind that sound like a list and not like poetry. Please let him be okay. Please let this end well. I listened to the murmurs and wrote down names. Every name alive with its own particular thread into the story. Then, around 11, the air changed. The usual town sounds, the hum of refrigerators, the far bark of a dog, quieted. A breeze came up that had the soft chill of early autumn, though the calendar had not yet turned. Someone at the end of the line began to hum. The hum grew, and then, like the way lightning comes without thunder sometimes, a light appeared over the river. Not harsh and electric, but a soft, blue-white glow that made the water look like poured glass. I remember the exact way people breathed in that moment. A collective intake like the first cold of winter. The light gathered above the place where the statue had lain broken. At first some thought it was a lantern or a projector placed on a barge. But when Father Mallory called out, "Blessed Mother," it was not a joke. The light shaped itself into the outline of a woman in a robe the color of clover and storm clouds. It was not a person walking toward us. It was a presence pressing into the night, like someone leaning their hand on the town's shoulder. I do not have the language to tell you what she looked like in a way that would satisfy every skeptic and every believer. Those who saw her later described different things. Some said her eyes were like small pools. Others said she had the tired, kind face of a mother who has watched too much. Tom would tell me afterward that she looked like a field at dawn. Henry said, later, that she looked exactly like the statue had looked before it was smashed. Not a replica, but the same mercy given a heartbeat. What made the moment undeniable was the number of people who saw her and the way their reactions matched like a choir. The carpenter Tom Ellis, who never touched anything delicate, wept openly. A teenager who had been dared by friends to show up stood frozen with his phone forgotten in his hand. The mailman put down his cap and crossed himself. Even the mayor's jaw, so used to firmness, slackened. She did not speak at first in words. The river hummed. The willow leaves did their small, noisy whisper. Then the woman raised a hand, not in scolding, but in a gesture that felt like a blessing and a warning at once. It was then that the voice came, or at least what people said they heard. Some swore it was a chorus in their bones. Others heard it as a single voice that was neither loud nor small. The message was simple and terrible and precise. Remember, for the living. Different people's accounts of what followed vary only in small ways. I will give what I heard and what others told me, because together their stories make the shape of what happened. She looked at Henry, who had come down to the edge of the bank with a blanket around his shoulders. Henry had been told to rest, yet he stood anyway, as if some gravity had pulled him forward. The woman's eyes settled on him, and this is the part that a man like me, who measures things in deadlines, found the hardest to explain. He shuddered like a man who had been struck by a memory. Do not hide from it, the voice said, for the town heard it at once. Do not let what is small become the thing that breaks you. Those words were not a diagnosis. They were a command. Henry's hands went to his chest, and he fell back. Tom caught him before he hit the ground. For a moment, we thought it was the illness acting, and the doctors who had warned us of shadows were right to fear the body's traitorous habits. But something deeper had happened. Henry opened his eyes, and with a steadier voice than I expected, said clearly, to no one in particular, "I remember." Afterward, Father Mallory insisted on trying to put the moment into homily-sized language. It was a call to reckon, he told me, voice thin with the aftertaste of adrenaline. Not to fear, but to look. Others saw a miracle of healing. The doctor who had been at the vigil, who had insisted he had only come for the community, later admitted to me that he had seen something that night that made his professional annotations feel small. What happened to Henry in the following weeks was both ordinary and miraculous. The scans showed a tumor, as the doctors had feared. It was operable. He underwent surgery, and the surgeon who carried out the operation, a careful man with a kind of bored confidence, told the family later that the thing they removed was smaller and less aggressive than the scan suggested. "We saw no spread," he told reporters. "Look, it's medicine. We are grateful for a clean operation." Henry's recovery was steady. He returned to the town with scars visible under shirts and an appetite for small things. Coffee at the bakery, a walk by the bridge. People credited prayer, the surgeon's skill, and the midnight light on the river with his survival. Henry credited the woman in blue and a doctor in green scrubs both. But the night at the river did more than whisper words of healing into Henry's ear. It widened into something communal. The woman's presence was not limited to Henry's body. She looked beyond him and into the town as if judging its true needs. People reported sudden clarity. A man who had been holding a grudge finally went and apologized to his sister. Teenagers who had once thrown stones at the old rectory came back with hands that cleared overgrown grass and nailed boards back into place. The very boys who had shoved the roadside statue into the bushes years before showed up at the rebuild with shovels and tears. There was, however, a darker edge. Not a punishment so much as a consequence. Those who continued to mock and dismiss the small holy things found themselves facing harder, everyday returns. A local man who had boasted in the diner about not believing in such nonsense slipped and broke his leg in a barn accident that had nothing to do with visions and everything to do with distracted pride. Some townspeople read this as punishment and others as coincidence. The woman in blue, by all accounts, never spoke of retribution. Her message was remember and forgive, not punish. But the human heart is a mix of mercy and law, and some people walked away seeing both. Tom's part in the story came to a close in a way that had the small tragedy of things that have been carried far too long. A week after Henry's operation, Tom did not come down to the bridge. People found him in the small room he rented by the feed store, holding his service ribbons and a photograph of a younger version of himself and a dog. He had a peaceful look on his face, the kind of tired peace veterans sometimes find when the last watch is over. At the funeral, Father Mallory spoke of persistence and of rest. The town carried Tom to the grave like they had carried the weight of his silence, with respect and with a kind of quiet relief. The shrine by the river was rebuilt bigger than before. Hands painted the Virgin's face with careful strokes. Mothers brought their children and taught them to kneel. Men who had not been to church in decades came back and found themselves facing a woman who seemed, in the candlelight, to look at each person like someone keeping a list. There were skeptics, of course, there always are. But the phenomenon had moved past single narratives and into a communal rhythm. Open shrines, repaired relationships, and a town that remembered how to offer back what had been given. I will not pretend that everything became bright and easy. Henry's scans will be followed by more scans. Hope in a small town is a fragile thing that must be tended like a garden. But the town's posture shifted. We had been given a warning, and we had taken it as both warning and mercy. The woman in blue had not scolded us. She had invited us to be honest with ourselves. That invitation was, in its way, terrifying. It required changes that were made of small, steady acts rather than grand proclamations. There is a story the old women still tell at the feed store, the one about the child and the woman in blue in 1937. People say the two events are connected, like two notes in a chord. I do not know if the Virgin in our case is the same woman who walked our town 80 years ago, or if she has always been many women stitched into one image. Mercy, warning, mother. What I know, as someone who has been a reporter and a neighbor, is this. When a small town is given a sign, the sign does not always come to save a single life. Sometimes it comes to save the way we hold each other. That night at the shrine, as the candles guttered and the town whispered and the river moved on, I felt something shift inside of me that I cannot measure in words. I have written obituaries and wedding notices. I have covered storms and school board fights. But I had never been part of a place where a light rose and asked everyone to remember. It changed how we spoke to one another in the grocery line. It changed how Henry walked, his hands no longer clenched, but open as if testing the world. The last image I have is a small one. After the night of the light, someone, I never learned who, left a scrap of blue fabric folded and tied with twine at the foot of the rebuilt statue. It was not a grand offering, only something thin and ordinary, but it looked like a promise. I picked up the scrap once just to feel it. It smelled faintly of rain. I left it where I found it. We did not get an answer for everything. We did not get a clear mathematical equation for why a broken statue and a man at a bridge and an old veteran and a rich man with a sudden illness would all line up like stars. We got, instead, a song threaded through the town, remember, forgive, tend. We found that sometimes medicine and prayer sit side by side, and neither one needs to shout to be heard. We found that miracles, if they exist, do not always come loud and blinding. Sometimes they come like a hand laid on the chest, quiet, insistent, difficult to ignore. If you take one thing from Holloway Ridge, it is this. Small towns keep their truths like embers. They can warm you or burn you. The woman in blue asked us not to let the small things grow into the kind of sorrow that hardens the heart. She asked us to remember the veterans, the children, the people we pass without knowing their scars. For a while at least we did. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. If it moved you, please like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true feeling tale from small towns and quiet places. Your support means these stories keep being told. Thank you, truly, and may you find someone to leave a light for when you need it.